Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lecture and follow-up lab, we're going to be looking at how we can connect to our AWS services and resources using a command line interface. So instead of having to use the AWS Management Console as we've done before, we can use text commands to achieve a lot of what we would normally do with that graphical user interface. We'll start off by looking at the back-end service that makes this happen, and that is the AWS Application Programming Interface, or API for short. Then we'll look at the number of different command line interface applications that we can install on our computer that will allow remote access to those services and resources. We'll also look at the AWS Cloud9 service, and we'll discuss why I primarily use this for anything to do with the command line interface and the security concerns around not using AWS Cloud9. And finally, we'll finish up by having a lab on using the Cloud9 service with the command line interface. When you're using the AWS Management Console like we've done in the past, AWS uses an application programming interface to enable that communication between your remote computer and the AWS services and resources. So how that works is that the AWS Management Console that you have been using is simply an application that is running on your browser, and it is sending HTTP calls backwards and forwards to this application programming interface backend on AWS. Now, the documentation is available for the AWS API for many services, for example, for the S3 API, for the EC2 Query API, but not for everything. So if you wanted to create your own application and there wasn't a software development kit for that language you're using, I can't imagine what language that would be, because there's certainly a very broad range of software development kits that are available, but it is possible for you to send HTTP calls to the API, provided you have that authentication done beforehand to actually do that. So it provides that back-end mechanism for that communication, and it's utilized again by the AWS Management Console. And we'll also use it with the AWS command line interface. So that again is an application that's running on your remote computer that will be sending HTTP calls to this API back end. Also, there are a number of software development kits that wrap the API up into libraries that can be used with, for example, JavaScript for PHP and Python and the like. And so you don't have to actually know how to do these HTTP calls. You just need to know how to use that software development kit. And the documentation for that is, of course, brilliant. And many other AWS services also use the API for communication within the AWS cloud. API calls to AWS can only be made by authenticated users with valid security credentials. For example, if you're using the Management Console, you would have been authenticated through your username and password. If you're using the command line interface application on a remote computer, then you would need to download an access key ID and secret and use that for authentication with AWS. If you're using an application on your browser that has been developed using one of the many AWS software development kits, then normally you would be issued with IAM temporary credentials. So what that means is that this application that you have may use login for Google, may use login for Facebook or whatever, and it might use your Google account or your Facebook account to authenticate you, and then that will be issuing temporary credentials for you to access the AWS resources through that browser-based application. And finally, we can actually log all of these API calls using the AWS CloudTrail service. So that's great if we have any security issues or any performance issues. We can go back through those CloudTrail logs and make sure that there's nothing untoward going on there. A picture tells 1,000 words. So how does this all work? Down the bottom there, we've got our AWS cloud that we want to connect to using our remote computer. And so that remote computer will be sending HTTPS API calls to the AWS cloud to get information from that AWS cloud and to issue instructions to the AWS services. So the first way we can do it there is we could have an IAM user, and that user will have an username and password. And they can use that username and password to log in to the AWS Management Console that is running inside of their browser. And the AWS Management Console running on that remote computer will then issue those API calls to the AWS cloud. The second option there is that we could have an IAM user download IAM credentials in the form of an access key and a secret to go with that access key. And so if that is presented to the AWS command line interface application that is running on that remote computer, that will authenticate that IAM user, and that IAM user will then be able to issue command line interface commands to the AWS cloud. And finally, if we've got an external user, so this user doesn't have an AWS account. For example, you might have an application like Dropbox, for example, and you have millions of users, and it's not practical, or it's actually not even possible to create 1 million IAM users. So you need to be able to somehow authenticate those users and to allow those users to temporarily access the AWS cloud. So you would use an application that is running using the software development kits, and that application could authenticate you using an OAuth authentication service. For example, it could use the AWS Cognito service. It could use Google, log in with Google, or log in with Facebook to authenticate you. And from that authentication, you will have limited and temporary access through that remote computer to the AWS cloud. Now, to start using the command line interface, the first thing that you need to do is that you need to have an application running on your computer that can allow that to happen. So the AWS standard CLI application, it's available for download for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it allows those API commands to be sent to AWS using the Windows command line or a Linux or Mac terminal application. There is also the AWS Shell application, which is a cross-platform standalone integrated shell environment that is written in Python that can provide even more features and more automation features to the CLI application. And finally, we've also got the AWS tools for Windows PowerShell. So you can run CLI commands within Windows PowerShell and at the same time use all of those automation tools that are available within PowerShell. Now, if you want to have a look at all of those CLI tools that are available, just go to the AWS website, aws.amazon.com/CLI. The AWS Cloud9 service is an integrated development environment, or IDE for short, that is running on an EC2 instance inside one of your VPCs, and you access it through the AWS Management Console. The Cloud9 service has a lot of tools already installed, so it also has the AWS CLI application pre-installed. Now, I predominantly use the AWS Cloud9 service for anything that requires CLI commands to be sent to AWS Cloud. The reason being is that it provides increased security because I don't have to download IAM credentials and have them sitting on a computer to be able to access that service. And that's very important because if those credentials are compromised, someone can not only use it with the CLI application, they could create their own application using a software development kit, use those IAM credentials, and could run bad malicious scripts that could cause a massive amount of damage and a massive amount of financial impact to your AWS infrastructure. Now, you may well ask, but what about the username and password that we use to connect to the management console? What if that gets compromised? Doesn't it have the same effect? And yes, you are correct. But coming up in the IAM section of this course, we'll be talking about how to implement multi-factor authentication on IAM accounts. So what that means is that if these username and passwords are compromised, they cannot be used to log into your account because there is a secondary, a multiple factor authentication process that also needs to be followed. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our discussion on the command line interface. Coming up next, we're going to be getting our hands on with the command line interface. So I look forward to seeing you in the lab.